Today is a special day, mere mortals, the 248th anniversary of the day the United States' founding fathers declared our independence from Great Britain. And then to get back at us, the British came up with a really mean nickname. A nickname that, between you and me, almost brings me to tears whenever I hear it. You know the one I'm talking about, right? There's a whole song about it, where a fancy man heading into town pretends he has pasta in his hat. Yeah, diss tracks in Europe had gone downhill from the Viking days. Saying the name nearly brings me to tears, but I'll do it for you guys. Yankee Doodle.
Yankee Doodle.
It is a super well-known song here in America, but funnily enough, nobody is really familiar with it beyond its opening line. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. Or if you grew up on my local playground, he would have been riding on a rocket, stuck his finger up his butt, and called it Hershey's chocolate. But I don't know if that version's been documented as well. As far as diss tracks go, this one is pretty weak, but it does raise some interesting questions. Who was Yankee Doodle? What town was he going to? Why was the poor guy being mocked for having a feather in his cap? And most importantly, did people back in the day really not know the difference between a feather and pasta? Well, straighten your hat, load your musket, and let's go to town with Yankee Doodle. Back in the 16, 17, and 1800s, before Taylor Swift could just release her bowels and dump 100 new songs on Spotify whenever she wanted, music was released to the public a little bit differently. There were certain folk tunes most people knew, and different lyrics would evolve for those tunes in different communities and countries. If a set of song lyrics was actually published, it was usually written to be sung to a tune people knew already. The oldest Yankee Doodle sheet music we know of was published without the lyrics in 1796, but some experts believe the tune originated from an Irish song called All the Way to Galway, because their second verses sound real similar. All the Way to Galway was written sometime during the Jacobite era, so between 1688 and 1750, which is right around the time the first draft of Yankee Doodle's anti-American lyrics were written. But we'll talk about that in a minute, because other theories have been presented as well. As I was conducting my own research into the origins of Yankee Doodle, I saw a lot of claims online that its tune and lyrics originated in 15th century Holland among Dutch farmhands, who supposedly received their wages in the form of buttermilk, and it went something like this. Janker didel doodle down, diddle doodle lanther, Yankee viver voever voun, buttermilk und tether. But in my line of work, I see claims like this all the time. The Muffin Man was a murderer. Ring around the rosies about the Black Plague. Sure, those origins are a lot more messed up in nature, but the truth is that even relatively boring origins like this, being sung by Dutch farmhands, don't always have evidence to support them. Sometimes they're just rumors repeated by online journalists desperate for clicks. And because the field of folklore is inherently ambiguous and the subject matter stretches all the way back in time to caveman days, these journalists get away with making bold, unsubstantiated claims with zero proof, because the proof has just been lost to the sands of time. The problem is they don't always mention that oh so important caveat, and that leads to a lot of confusion where their readers start sharing these theories as fact because they oh so badly want them to be. So with this in mind, I did some digital detective work, and the only non-journalistic resource I could find that mentioned the Dutch origin with the farmers was Wikipedia. Not a hopeful start, but in this case, we were lucky enough to be given 2 citations. A New York Times article from 1989, so yet another journalist, and a book called A History of Music, Volume 2. Dated to the year 1912. The Times article pretty much just stated what I've already mentioned about the Dutch farmers, only it placed them in the 1500s, not 15th century. But the nameless author of the article didn't cite where they got their info, so I wasn't convinced. Looking into the Historical Encyclopedia of Music was a different experience though. This book from 1912 makes the very same claim about it being a vintage Dutch farm song, but makes no mention of the time period. So I'm not sure where everyone got got the idea that it's from the 14 or 1500s specifically. Maybe there's an earlier source I'm missing, but I couldn't find it. The book also expands on the song's origins. It features a letter written by the American Secretary of Legation and dated June 3rd, 1858, where the secretary says Yankee Doodle's tune matches a children's rhyme sung during the reign of King Charles, more than 200 years earlier, and that it was still sung in nurseries of that day. Lucy Lockett lost her pocket. Kitty Fisher found it. Nothing in it, nothing on it, but the binding round it. Then it describes how it became an Oliver Cromwell diss track, stating that during the English Civil War, the commander rode into the town of Oxford on a small pony with a single feather in his hat that was called Macaroni. But here's my favorite part. These aforementioned claims are clearly described as rumors and theories. The book actually acknowledges that it's just repeating what other people have said without offering proof. And since bloggers and journalists are still repeating these claims, it means our ideas for where this song and its lyrics originally came from are just as unproven today as they were over 100 years ago. It's important to note, though, that this doesn't make these theories wrong by default. It's totally possible that the Dutch farmhand explanation originated with someone with the knowledge and authority to make it. But whatever evidence we needed to prove that claim true was lost well before that music history book was written back in 1912. Those Dutch lyrics had to come from somewhere though, right? And we know it wasn't from some bogus blog because those same lyrics were featured in that old-ass book. So let's say they're legit. What was that song really saying? Now, those of you who are fluent in Middle Dutch, both of ya, might have been a little confused after I read through the original Dutch lyrics, but I swear it's not just my terrible pronunciation that makes them nonsensical. Actual linguists have looked at these lyrics and determined they're mostly gibberish. There are some translatable words, like a vijver would be a pond, and botermilk would probably be buttermilk, because like I said, Dutch farmhands were paid in buttermilk, which coincidentally is how YouTube pays me. Also, some believe that Janker and Yankee might be a reference to the Dutch names Jan, which translates to John, and Yankee, which is a pet name that could translate to Johnny or Baby John. But most of these words mean nothing. It was a silly nonsense song that 1400s Dutch people sang for mindless entertainment. Or was it? Wait, who started the Vsauce music? To better understand the meaning of Yankee Doodle, we have to take a close look at the lyrics. Not only what they say, but the words they use to say it. And to do this accurately, we have to find the oldest variant of the English version that we all know and love. That we all know and tolerate. There is one version that's been dated to 1775 called The Farmer and His Sons Return from a Visit to the Camp, written by Harvard sophomore and Minuteman Edward Bangs. But the lyrics are seriously different and tell a mostly nonsensical story about what they saw in the camp of the New England militia. The only valuable contribution it makes to the overall Yankee Doodle lore is it introduces a now iconic phrase that I haven't found in any other variants. Yankee Doodle Dandy. Yankee Doodle, keep it up. Yankee Doodle Dandy. Mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. No, I'm not going to unpack that last line. The oldest known example of the Yankee Doodle lyrics we know today being put into print can be found on page 82 of the Nursery Rhymes of England, written by James Orchard Halliwell and printed in 1842. Yankee Doodle came to town upon a Kentish pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called him Macaroni. Now, 1842 is obviously long after the Revolutionary War, but according to folklore, this song was sung by the British Army to mock the Americans during our War for Independence, which kicked off in 1775. Some legends claim this rhyme was inspired by a similar rhyme written by British Army surgeon Dr. Richard Shuckburgh after he fought alongside Yankees in the French and Indian War a decade or so before the Revolutionary War, because apparently mocking the men whose lives he was tasked with saving was his kind of humor. Brother Ephraim sold his cow and bought him a commission, and then he went to Canada to fight for the nation. But when Ephraim he came home, he proved an arrant coward. He wouldn't fight the Frenchmen there for fear of being devoured. So I guess in this song, Brother Ephraim is supposed to be a Yankee, and he's saying that when Yankee soldiers returned home from Canada, they were too scared to fight off the French? or something. The exact meaning may be lost on me, but it seems pretty obvious that whoever this song is about, Shuckburgh meant to insult them. And so naturally, the next iteration followed this trend. But what exactly is wrong with Yankee Doodle coming to town upon a Kentish pony, sticking a feather in his cap, and calling it macaroni? The answer, funnily enough, is hidden in the meaning of macaroni, which I never knew was a fashion term. In the 1760s, a fashion wave crashed upon the shores of ye olde England. Suddenly, the well-to-do young fellows of Britain were wearing expensive lace, imported silk, and very tall powdered wigs with little hats on top you needed a ladder to reach. They were wearing bright colors, carrying around fancy walking sticks for no reason, pointy buckled shoes. They were awful to look at, and pretty much everyone hated them. These wealthy young men were influenced by their travels to Italy and France, where they went on grand tours and socialized with the Italian and French elite, who had a fashion sense I can only describe as flamboyant. The English had another term for it though, macaroni, which stemmed from these same young men's preference for foreign foods, like macaroni, which at that time you could only get in Italy and was therefore considered extremely fancy. England already had words like fop and dandy for overly fashionable do-nothing young men, but macaroni was way more specific. For the time, macaroni style was very edgy because it was more androgynous than the typical English style. These were young men dressing kind of like women. Some critics back then saw macaroni style as excessive and silly, and others saw it as effeminate or possibly homosexual, which was illegal in Britain at that time. So how does this all translate into a diss against Americans? Well, at first glance, it seems like they're calling my man Yankee Doodle an overly fashionable soy boy beta male. The same words you'd use to describe someone like Harry Styles. But somehow, it's worse than that. What they're really saying is that Yankee Doodle aspires to be a high-fashion, slightly effeminate Brit, but this backwater American hick is too stupid to know how to do it, with his best attempt being the oh-so-pathetic feather in his hat. The terminology is all pretty silly, but when you think about it, it's actually a pretty clever insult, saying that even America's best and bravest men can only dream of being one of the lowliest people in British society. So Yankee Doodle was a song meant to make fun of Americans, but this all raises another question. When and how did the British have the time to hit us with this literal song of an insult while fighting a war? Well, the song wasn't sung exclusively during battles. In the 1770s, when tensions between Great Britain and soon-to-be America started to rise and divide the country down to the familial level, insults like this were passed along through word of mouth at the local pub, town square, whatever public establishments people hung out at back then. But believe it or not, this song did serve a function to the British military, beyond hurting Americans' fifis. You see, when armies march around on foot, they need to keep a steady pace. Can't march too slow or it'll take forever, but not too fast or people will get tired. So armies of this era would have drummers to keep everyone marching to the same beat, and someone would play songs everyone could sing along to on a fife, a little flute. Yankee Doodle was one of these songs. The British Grenadiers song, What You're Hearing Right Now, is another. By the time the war kicked off, the Americans were very familiar with the Yankee Doodle song, which even they had to admit was pretty catchy. And the reason I say they had to admit it is because those Americans did what America does best. They found something they liked and took it for themselves.
I like that. I'm gonna steal it. That's mine now.
All right, cool.
The story goes that Yankee Doodle was officially turned on its head on April 19th, 1775, when the British Army attempted to steal military supplies from an armory outside Boston. They were intercepted by a last-minute American militia who was tipped off the night before by Paul Revere. This conflict, which would go on to be known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, ended with the Americans chasing the British troops back to Boston. And according to legend, they were singing one song on their road to victory, Yankee Doodle. No, it doesn't matter how I say it. It's never gonna sound badass. Whether that last bit is true or not, Yankee Doodle really was reappropriated by the new American nation, and the term Yankee became a term of pride. For the most part, at least. It's one of those words where the meaning changes depending on the context. Outside of the United States, it could be used as a generalization for all Americans. But if you're in New England, Yankee is sometimes still used to refer to the descendants of the original English settlers in New England, as opposed to later immigrant groups like the Irish or Italians. My people. These Yankees moved west in huge numbers as the U.S. expanded and were the primary settlers in the northern band of the country, stretching from New England to Michigan to Minnesota to the Pacific Northwest. Which is why, if you're in the southern U.S., the part of the country that tried to secede in the Civil War, Yankee just means anyone from the North, and it's usually not meant in an endearing way. Fun fact, the Confederate Army actually rewrote it with their own lyrics to make fun of the Union. The first verse went, Yankee Doodle had a mind to whip the Southern traders because they did not choose to live on codfish and potatoes. Huh, weird. Here I was thinking the war was about slavery. Yankee Doodle said he found by all the census figures that he could starve the rebels out if he could steal their... Okay, so I was right. Yankee Doodle may have a long and complicated history, but the song itself is simple, and so is the lesson we can learn from it. The moment that you start embracing the hate being thrown your way, when you accept it and take it as a point of pride, you're untouchable. By refusing to allow your enemies to mess with your head, you're really gonna mess with theirs. But what do you think, Yankees? And everybody else? What's your big takeaway from the messed up origins of Yankee Doodle? I have a question. Are you a Yankee Doodle Dandy? I'll see you all again next week with a slightly different kind of episode than you're used to from me. Until then, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.